Winter's grip tightened on the land, and the snow fell like a thick blanket over the Pennsylvania fields. In the quiet of the morning, Eli Fisher's secret trick would reveal itself, a simple act of patience that would change the way his family hunted deer forever. The same cold that could freeze a man's soul became the key to his survival. Before we begin, share where you're watching from, and if stories of ingenuity, faith, and simple living resonate with you, join us for tomorrow's tale. Eli Fisher had never been a man of unnecessary words. The thick woolen coat he wore was patched at the elbows, his boots worn from years of faithful use. But beneath the weathered exterior lay a sharp mind, one that knew the wilderness better than most. The snow had already started falling, light at first, then steadily picking up in volume, as if the mountains themselves were whispering of what was to come. This was the time of year when the landscape became unforgiving, the harsh winter winds biting at the skin, the deer retreating deep into the thick pines. But Eli knew something that his neighbors didn't. He knew that the winter could be harnessed, not feared. As the evening came, Eli stood outside his cabin, the cold night air nipping at his cheeks. The snowflakes drifted slowly, like little stars coming to rest on the ground. It was time. Slowly, with a practiced hand, he placed the last piece of the trap, an old deer snare, into the hollowed-out logs he had prepared days before. His mind didn't wander. It was focused, deliberate. The trick he had devised would not only make hunting more effective, but would also save his family from the many hardships of winter. The years of trial and error had brought him here to a place where his knowledge of the land intersected with patience. In the deep snow, when hunger started gnawing at a person's belly, most people gave in to the quick solution. Eli knew better. It was never about rushing. It was always about waiting. And now, as he set the trap in place, a glimmer of light from the cabin window flickered in the distance, casting its soft glow over the snowy fields. The next morning was quiet, still, and heavy with the kind of silence that only a fresh blanket of snow could create. Eli rose early, his wife's soft breath still rising in the warmth of their shared bed, his children curled beneath thick wool blankets. But Eli had long learned that sleep was a luxury that could not be afforded in winter. The fields called to him, the woods beckoned with the promise of food. Stepping carefully into the snow, Eli pulled his coat tightly around him, the weight of it now comforting as it shielded him from the bite of the cold. His breath, slow and measured, came out in small clouds that disappeared as quickly as they formed. He knew that today would require patience, the kind of patience that his ancestors had passed down to him, and that his children would someday pass down to their own. The trap was set, but it was only half the battle. The snow worked its magic on the land, making it harder for the deer to hide, their tracks faint in the pristine white. But it also made them vulnerable. The wind could carry the scent of a hunter from miles away, causing the deer to scatter in fear. Eli had learned to work with the wind. He had learned that sometimes the trick wasn't chasing the prey, but waiting. For hours, Eli sat by the trap, his gaze fixed on the horizon, watching the slow crawl of daylight as it lit the snowy field. He felt his muscles grow stiff as the cold began to seep through his boots, the edges of his fingers numb despite the warmth of his mittens. But he didn't move, he simply waited. The snow, the wind, and the silence were his companions, just as they had been in winters before. His mind drifted for a moment to his father, who had taught him this patience, this quiet method of working with the land. "You wait long enough," his father had said many years ago, "and the land will give you what you need. It always does." The words had stuck with Eli like a prayer he carried in his heart. By midday, Eli rose stiffly, walking the short distance back to the trap. His eyes scanned the snow-dappled land with the sharpness of a hawk. There, nestled between the pine trees, was his first catch. A deer, young and strong, had been caught in the snare. Its struggle was brief, a reminder of the precision with which Eli had set his trap. With reverence, he knelt beside the animal, offering a prayer for its life. Then, he carefully undid the snare and began the work of bringing it back to his family. He was not just hunting. He was fulfilling a responsibility, one that required skill and humility. As the deer's weight settled over his shoulders, he couldn't help but feel the quiet satisfaction of knowing his method had worked. The snow, once a blanket of despair, had now become an ally. In the heart of winter, Eli had discovered a truth that only those who had lived through enough seasons could understand. Survival wasn't about struggling against the land, but learning how to work with it. As the days passed, word of Eli's success spread like wildfire among the surrounding farms. While many admired the steady resilience he had shown in the face of winter's harshness, there were others who doubted his method. It wasn't the hunting that troubled them, but the way he had chosen to make his life in this quiet corner of the world. Eli's neighbors, men who had toiled through countless winters themselves, had always relied on the familiar, tried and true methods. They built their cabins fast and cheap, rushed to plant their crops in the spring, and hunted with speed rather than patience. To them, Eli's careful preparations seemed wasteful, slow, and unnecessary. They had lived through winters before, and they were sure they knew the best way to survive. One chilly morning, Eli was walking back from the woods when he came upon Samuel Brenner, a neighbor who had never been shy about voicing his opinions. Samuel stood by his own small barn, his hands tucked into the folds of his coat as he watched Eli approach. His gaze was sharp, questioning. "Morning, Eli," Samuel called, his voice cutting through the morning stillness. "I see the deer traps are still doing their job." Eli smiled, the warmth of the exchange softening the cold air. "Yes, they've worked well so far. The deer are heavier this year." Samuel's brow furrowed as he crossed his arms. "I've heard, but I'm still not sure about your approach. Spending days preparing a trap when you could have a deer in a few hours if you just went out and hunted the old way?" Eli paused, sensing the skepticism in Samuel's words. "It's not about getting the deer quickly," Eli said, his voice low but steady. "It's about making sure we don't exhaust the land. This land gives us what we need, but only if we are wise in how we take it." Samuel scoffed. "Well, I've survived just fine with my rifle and a few good hours of tracking." "Your way of waiting seems like you're putting too much trust in the land, Eli." Eli took a step forward, lowering his voice. "The land has always provided when we've been patient, and when we work with it, not against it." Samuel didn't answer right away. He simply shook his head, turning toward his barn, his boots crunching in the snow. "We'll see, Eli. We'll see how long that patience gets you this winter." Eli stood for a moment, watching his neighbor walk away. There was a sting to Samuel's words, a reminder that the old ways were hard to change, even when the signs were clear. But Eli knew, deep down, that he had made the right choice. Time would tell whether his faith in patience and in the land would prove wise. As the days turned colder, Eli could feel the weight of his community's doubt pressing in. It was not the weight of the snow, or even the cold. It was the weight of tradition, of generations of men who had relied on what they knew. And yet, Eli felt a deep conviction, an unspoken understanding that the path he was walking, though quiet, was the one that would carry him through. A week before Christmas, the storm came. It was no ordinary snowfall, but a violent storm that swept through the valley with a fury unlike anything Eli had seen in years. The wind howled through the trees, bending them low with its icy breath. The snow came thick and fast, piling up in drifts against the barns and fences. The quiet that had filled the valley seemed to vanish overnight, replaced by the raw power of nature. Eli stood at the window of his cabin, watching the storm with a furrowed brow. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of concern. The deer would need to seek shelter, just as his family would. And if the storm lasted for days, the food supplies in town would soon be gone. If the train couldn't get through, if the roads were impassable, they would be isolated. His wife, Anna, came to his side, her face pale with worry. "Eli, should we not go into town, just to be sure?" Eli shook his head, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow. "The roads will be too bad. We'll have to rely on what we've prepared." Anna sighed, knowing better than to argue. They had made their preparations, just as Eli had taught. The wood was stacked high, the pantry full of preserves, and the deer traps were set. It would be enough, it had to be enough. That night, the storm raged on. The wind seemed to tear through the very bones of the earth. Eli knew the animals were already hiding, taking refuge in the thick pines and hollows of the land. But it was the cold that he feared. The cold was relentless, creeping into every crack, into the very marrow of his bones. At dawn, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Eli donned his thickest coat, lacing up his boots before stepping out. Into the deep snow, his breath misted in the air as he trudged to the first trap. The morning was still and silent, the storm muffling every sound. He walked slowly, his footsteps leaving deep impressions in the snow. When he reached the trap, the sight of the snow-covered earth lifted his heart. There, nestled in the deep snow, was a buck large, strong, its body half buried in the snow, struggling against the tight snare. Eli's hands worked quickly, loosening the trap. The struggle had been brief, a reminder of how quickly the land could change. Eli paused for a moment, taking a deep breath in the stillness. This was the moment he had waited for, the moment he had prayed for. The land had provided, just as he had known it would. The trap, set with patience and care, had captured the deer, just as the storm had captured the world in its frozen grasp. With reverence, Eli knelt beside the deer. It was no longer struggling. It was still, quiet, its eyes wide but calm. He placed a hand on its side, offering thanks for its life, as he always did before taking the gift the land had provided. The storm may have tested their faith, but it was the patient work, the quiet understanding of how the land gave, that would carry them through. The storm had passed by Christmas Eve, leaving behind a blanket of snow that covered the earth like a quiet, sacred promise. The wind, once fierce, had calmed, and a cold stillness settled over the land. In the quiet of that morning, Eli stood outside his cabin, his gaze sweeping over the fields. The world seemed to have stopped. The weight of the snow, the hush of the landscape, and the absence of sound, save for the faint creaking of the trees, all spoke to him of the hard-earned peace that followed a trial. The deer that had been trapped a few days earlier was already butchered and stored in the cold cellar, ready to feed his family through the long winter months. His heart was lighter than it had been in days, for though the storm had tested his faith, it had also affirmed his choice. The method he had trusted, slow and steady, had proven its worth once again. And now, with the worst of the winter behind them, Eli could breathe. He had heard the whispers, the skepticism from neighbors who had called his methods foolish. He had seen the raised eyebrows, the looks of doubt whenever they spoke about his slow approach to survival. But now, in the stillness after the storm, Eli knew that his choices had been right. The land had provided, just as he had known it would. Anna stepped out of the cabin, her cheeks flushed from the warmth of the fire. She had seen the quiet joy in Eli's eyes, and she knew what it meant. "Another year, Eli," she said softly, her voice full of the kind of reverence that only comes after hardship. "We've made it." Eli nodded, his hand brushing the snow from the edge of the porch. "We've made it because we didn't rush, we waited, we prepared." Anna smiled, but her eyes reflected a deeper understanding. She had trusted Eli, even when others had doubted. She had seen how carefully he set the traps, how he had walked through the snow with purpose when others might have panicked. She knew that it wasn't just the land that Eli relied on, it was his faith in patience, in the simple rhythm of life that could not be hurried. As they walked through the snow together, Eli could hear the soft crunch of their footsteps, the only sound in the still world. The cabin stood behind them, strong and steady, its walls built not in haste, but with the intention of withstanding whatever the winter could bring. It was a quiet victory, a subtle reminder that survival on the land was never about fighting against nature, but working with it. Later that day, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the Fisher family gathered around the table. The warmth of the hearth filled the room, and the smell of freshly baked bread mingled with the scent of venison stew. Outside, the dayplerie end of ardor. Snow continued to fall, but inside, the fire burned bright, and Eli looked around at his family. There was no fanfare, no dramatic speech. There was only the stillness of knowing that they had made it through. The work, the quiet faith, the waiting it had, all led to this moment. And in the silence of the evening, Eli knew that just as the land had provided, so too would it continue to offer its gifts as long as they treated it with the same patience, humility, and respect. The storm had tested them, but in the end, it was their preparation, their quiet resolve, that had carried them through.